It's always a great pleasure to be here. Seems rather strange, but I was talking just the other evening at a pub in Newfoundland. I wasn't speaking, I was just talking with somebody. And they had spent a considerable amount of time in Texas and remarked how similar a lot of the people are between Newfoundland and Texas. And that extends to an extraordinary sense of place, and an extraordinary sense of history, and an extraordinary sense of identity. And those things are very much at the heart, I think, of the discussions that we are having here today, and very much a part of the deliberations that will go forward from this discussion afterwards. I'd like to thank everybody for inviting me and for making it possible for me to be here. And at the same time, I would like to commend you for what you are doing. This issue of what happens with wildlife and what happens in the field of conservation is not some sideshow. It may be true that a significant portion of the public are not engaged in this issue, and that is not just true in Texas, that is true everywhere in North America, and in fact it is true virtually around the world. Nevertheless, this issue of conservation will emerge as the great debate in society, and it will become recognized as the greatest single challenge that we face, not only as Texans, but also as people who are global citizens. The natural resources of this continent and of this country belong to the citizenry. And it is this demographic or this democratic right that leads to democratic engagement. And democratic engagement is what keeps wildlife with us. The day that there is no democratic engagement in wildlife will be the day that wildlife will eventually become irrelevant to people. And at that stage, wildlife ultimately will suffer, and the landscapes upon which wildlife depends will no longer be seen as things of a critical nature for us to concern ourselves with. That is the first point that I'd like to make in this address, that wildlife is a public resource. The second point I would like to make, with equal clarity, is that wildlife does not exist by accident. There is a myth, I call it the myth of Eden. There is a myth in the public mind, and often in the mind of legislators, that wildlife exists by accident. And by that I mean that simply if you have enough land, and if you, from some people's point of view, if you keep human beings away from wildlife, wildlife will thrive. The actual fact is that wildlife will thrive nowhere on this planet any longer, unfortunately, without the intervention of man. Whether it is in the policies to protect large-scale wilderness areas, or whether it is in regulated hunting activities, or private landowners doing the right things for their land, wildlife will not exist on this planet going forward unless human beings are actively engaged on its behalf. That is the sad reality. I say sad because it would be nice for us to believe that the globe is big enough for the 7 or 8 billion of us, going on to 9, and that wildlife would thrive without our intervention in some far recesses of the world that we personally do not know about. That is a myth. We will keep them with us, the others who taught us to be human. We will keep them with us by our actions, at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the global level. That is the only chance they have. We have a legacy. And that's a very important point. We have a legacy of wildlife conservation. And this country, the United States of America, played an absolutely pivotal role, I am prepared to say the lead role, in establishing this idea around the world. It was not long after the great and fateful Civil War of your country, that engagement that has so defined America, that the rise of conservation as an idea occurred. In fact, there were hunting-based conservation clubs established in your country, in the United States of America, in the 1830s. 1830s. By the time of the Civil War, there was about 500 of those organizations already established in various parts of this country. So this is not a new game for Americans. This is a game you've played long and hard and extremely well. It is not uncommon when I meet people and meet families in particular after an address or at some meeting, they'll introduce me to their children. And often the lineup will go something like this. This is Mary, and Mary wishes to become a lawyer. And this is Jack, and Jack wishes to become a businessman. And then there's Jane or Bill or whoever, and you know, they're only interested in wildlife. And already you can see this idea that wildlife is somehow something less than what those other undertakings are. It's a nice thing, it's a good thing, it's a positive thing, but it's not necessarily such an important thing. We will come to turn this on its head and recognize that if we cannot keep them with us, we cannot enjoy prosperity and peace, freedom, and a good life. Because if that land is taken to the extent that we cannot keep them with us, then we will enter a stage of conflict like we have never seen before. You have been Americanizing the world since you defeated Britain. Since this ragtag bunch of militiamen defeated the greatest army and navy that the world had ever seen, you have been Americanizing the world. You have brought the world democracy. You have brought the world the notions of freedom under the law. You have brought the world the ideas of the individual being unfettered in a capitalistic structure that will benefit your country. You have instituted the ideas of free speech. You have, in fact, established all of those things, the application of the judiciary, the separation. You have instituted all those things that modern nations around the world must have if they want to be seen as progressive nations. All from here. You weren't alone in some of these things, but in the collective and the force you have had around the world, you have been singular. This is not my history. This is the history of the world. And across the world, when nation-states wish to be seen as modern, they identify and adopt those principles of America. In my view, these issues of democracy, freedom under the law, etc., are no greater whatsoever than the concept of conservation that was born fundamentally in this country, joined with by Canada to form the North American approach to conservation, and spread around the world. It was not only here that this arose. The Europeans who came, the British in particular who came to this country, we borrowed things from them. But the institution of conservation, the idea of reserves, the idea of national parks, the idea of regulated recreational hunting for everyone, the idea that we could rescue wildlife through that mechanism, that is an American phenomenon. And it grieves me, and it frustrates me, as I'm sure it must you, that most of the people in your society have absolutely no idea that that is an achievement of your country. We should change that. You should change that. It is a matter of greatness, and it is a matter of legacy. When the Europeans came here, when we all came here, we discovered a landscape of unimaginable resource richness. We saw a circumstance where it seemed impossible to limit the abundance that this continent provided. The swarms in the skies, the animals of the plains, the great runs of fishes, the flotillas of whales, the rookeries of seals and walrus, etc. There seemed to be absolutely no limit to wildlife, and we pursued it in that way. Between 1820 and 1860, the number of people in America living in cities increased from about 5% to about 20%. It's the greatest expansion of urbanization in the history of your country. The end result of that were massive markets available for wildlife, and those markets would be fed by the entrepreneurial spirit of Americans who found a way to use that resource along with the forest resources and other resources of this country in a way that can only be seen as excessive. And what is amazing is that at the same time that the U.S. cavalry was in Yellowstone protecting wildlife in your first national park, that's how severe this problem was, the cavalry had to go to Yellowstone to defend wildlife in your national park, the first in the world. At the same time that that was happening, groups of individuals were deciding that we needed to look at resources in a completely different way. Now, since the time of agriculture 10,000 years ago, we had built a belief amongst ourselves as human beings that the further we took ourselves away from the dependence on the natural world, the more civilized we had become. The extraordinary intellectual change that was born in this country was to reverse that notion and to say that we would only be civilized and only be progressive if we could learn to live with nature and act as proper stewards for it. This was not a small idea. This was not something that, just was frivolously conceived and then laid aside. This launched a movement of which today we are still part and of which this meeting is one of the other points on that long chain of discussion and dialogue. It is an extraordinary phenomenon. It was in 1887 that the Boone and Crockett Club was formed, and that was a seminal piece of work in the sense that it brought together the great intellectual and wealthy people of this country to say that wildlife mattered, and we were going to launch a new approach to the conservation of wildlife, an approach that eventually led to what we see as the North American model of wildlife conservation. It is also important to understand that Canada, which at times there were ideas, even Teddy Roosevelt himself was still dreaming about taking Canada during his presidency. So we had a little bit of to and fro-ing about that. I'm from Newfoundland, so I can speak dispassionately about Canada, having only joined them in 1949. So we had a situation where Canada, being a colony of Britain, should have gone on with a British process, a process where many people do not have access to game populations, and where the average man does not necessarily have the opportunities to hunt and fish and recreate in the same way that is true in the United States and now in Canada. But Canada did not. Because of the outreach by Teddy Roosevelt to Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Prime Minister of Canada, and because of the establishment of American-like models in that country, we developed by 1916, by the time of the Migratory Bird Convention Act, one of the most successful pieces of legislation in the world, and the first continental legislation really for the protection of wildlife, land-based wildlife, we came an enormous distance in already establishing the principles that we see as the North American model. Canada and the United States having basically the same approach to the conservation of wildlife. Now, I ask you for a moment just to consider what the implications would have been if Canada and the United States had taken different roads. Think of the complications, the problems, the challenges that would have arisen. However, what we developed is, to this day, 120 years approximately later, we have to this day the only continental model for wildlife conservation in the world. The only one, still, after all this time, after the establishment of the United Nations and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, all of those efforts, you launched what now is, still to this day, the only continental model for conservation in the world. We went into the period of the 1930s with Aldo Leopold and other great members of this movement and created and refined this model. But this model is recognized as such because there are basic principles associated with it. The reason it's called a model is because there are a series of basic principles that are extended through Canada and the United States with regard to the conservation of wildlife. Now, many people, when they first meet the model, believe that what we're suggesting is that somebody sat down, whether it was Teddy Roosevelt or George Bird Grinnell or Clifford Sifton in Canada or whoever it was, and sat back and said, let's enshrine these 7 or 8 principles in a model and launch it on the world. That's not how it works, and that's not how it worked. It evolved over time. It arose out of the context of the two nations, and it reflected the feelings and the beliefs of the citizenry of the countries, inspired by extraordinary leaders, of whom Teddy Roosevelt, despite his own failings, like every man he had them, deserves to be singled out as probably the greatest champion of conservation, certainly at the political level, that North America has ever seen. A sad comment, don't you think? That in 100 years, we still have nobody who can even so much as walk in his shadow in political office in both countries. Nevertheless, we do have a model, and there are recognizable principles. The importance of these principles is what they have given us. These principles are not necessarily above challenge. They're not necessarily above debate. But the historical achievements of this model and the principles associated with it cannot be denied, and nor can they be toyed with frivolously. They are a fundamental part of what has rescued wildlife on this continent, because you have to remember that in this country and in Canada, by the turn of the 20th century, we had decimated wildlife. We very nearly lost whitetails, can you believe it? We certainly very nearly lost beaver, Canada geese, black bear, wood duck, pronghorn, grizzly, on and on. Not just the list elk, not just the list of the minuscule and the unknown animals, but the big, charismatic fauna that everybody recognizes and loves today. We were driving it to its limits. That's why the cavalry went in to save the remnant elk population in Yellowstone National Park. And we set up this model with its principles, and these principles have rescued wildlife on this continent to an extraordinary degree. It is a miracle of success. And that is why, regardless of changes in society, regardless of regional identities, regardless of personal passions, we must objectively look at the values that this model has brought to our society and to wildlife. The most fundamental principle of this model is the idea of the public trust. This is the foundational model and the foundation of the model. The notion that wildlife is owned by no one, but is owned, in a sense, by everyone, and that it is held in trust by the government, by the state, the government, as a trustee for its people. The history of this notion goes all the way back to Greek and Roman law, was part of the principles of the Magna Carta, and as a result have influenced our own laws here in North America fundamentally. This is an extraordinary proposition. No longer would just elites have access to wildlife, but every man and woman, every citizen would have an ownership in that resource, and the state would manage and hold in trust that resource for the people. This is what gives us the chance to have every citizen in the discussion about wildlife, because they are the people who collectively own that resource. There are many threats to this. There always have been. And in any democratic society, Challenges must be debated. We also, as a principle of that model, eliminated markets for dead wildlife. We didn't eliminate the opportunity for access to wildlife. We eliminated the markets for dead wildlife. This was to control the massive slaughter of game, whether it was bison or shorebirds or pronghorn or turkeys. It didn't matter. It was meant to stop the massive flow of dead wildlife into the large urban centers that were creating the markets and the opportunities for profit, which naturally people took advantage of. We largely eliminated markets for dead wildlife. We decided that the allocation of wildlife, your access to wildlife, our use of wildlife, our recreating with wildlife would be decided by law and not by status. Right across this country, right across Canada, from south to north, west to east. This was not a small decision either. Neither was the elimination of those markets. There were a lot of strong interests who stood up to Roosevelt and others and said, "You cannot do this. You will destroy my opportunities as an American." Roosevelt had no magic wand. He died a young man. Part of the reason he died a young man is because he wore himself out. We decided that wildlife would be allocated by law. And believe me, there's lots of parts of the world where wildlife is not allocated by law still to this day. We would kill only for a legitimate purpose. One of the great achievements of North American conservation is the fact that if we did take wildlife, we would do it in a non-wasteful way. We would not kill them frivolously. So the massive slaughters that took place on the shorebird breeding colonies to provide feathers for hats was deemed unacceptable. Not by just Roosevelt and a few others, but by most of the women's movements in those eastern cities. People who were concerned about fashion joined with this and decided that we would kill only for legitimate purpose, and we would not waste what we had killed, because the life of every single one of them was worth more than that. We could kill for food, for fur, for self-defense, for protection of property, etc. But by and large, we had to have this legitimate purpose. No one could take a weapon and kill a living creature just because they felt like doing so. They are not targets. Wildlife as an international resource, this was one of the extraordinary achievements, to recognize that wildlife moved across the boundaries of nations, and therefore we must coordinate our activities in support of them. You know, one of the most amazing things today remains this North American Waterfowl Management Plan. 1916, that legislation was brought in, which coordinated activities between the United States of America and Canadians at the biological, legislative, recreational level. And do you know, to this day, that money raised in the United States of America flows north into Canada to help ensure that the breeding populations of waterfowl in that country are sustainable and well managed, so that people in the United States, of course, can benefit from them. But the point is that the cooperation of the two countries has been successful for almost 100 years. And even today, this country provides money to that country in support of this conservation principle. That doesn't happen everywhere. That's not the way the world works. But we have made this happen for wildlife on this continent. It was decided since the time of Roosevelt that science would be the basis of decision-making. That was not a small decision for somebody to make in 1887 either. Where was the science going to come from? We didn't have any. And yet the decision was that we would develop corps of elite, highly trained individuals who would work from a scientific basis for the management of wildlife populations in both countries. And we did it. so that the policies that were enacted to manage wildlife populations would not be someone's opinion, but would be based on a proper experimental view of the world, to know that what we thought was at least close to reality. And you should think of some of the things we thought before we developed this science. Thomas Jefferson, one of the intellectual giants of this country, of the world, in fact. When Lewis and Clark went west, he expected them to come back with mammoths and mastodons, because he and many other people believed they still lived in this country. We did not have the science. We had to work to establish this science. The idea of the democracy of hunting, the idea that every citizen, every single citizen, in every state, in every province, in every city, in every county, in every town, that they would have equal access to the opportunity for hunting under the law. That is a fundamental principle of the North American model. Now, I want you to consider for a few moments, as this model arose from the intellectual genius of this country. And I cannot emphasize enough that in the next 50 years, if not long before, the world will come to recognize that this idea that we should learn how to live with nature and find a way to steward those systems and those wildlife populations going forward will be recognized as being as important an achievement of the human mind as democracy and freedom under the law. Because in the end, our own survival is going to depend on how well we apply these principles. And if you want to see the effects of not applying these principles, I ask you to travel to parts of Africa, to parts of Indonesia, to other parts of the world, and see what happens. And the picture is not pretty, and it can happen anywhere. The rise of improbable social movements, we must not forget, arose in some of the most advanced countries of Europe for 2 world wars. I want you to think about what we did not have when this model was born in the late 1880s, in the early 1900s. We did not have a funding mechanism for wildlife in this country or in Canada. We had absolutely no funding mechanisms whatsoever. We had no university programs conferring degrees on people who were working in the field of wildlife science. That profession did not exist. We had none of the great NGOs that exist, like your own, or like the Nature Conservancy, or Ducks Unlimited, or all of these that grew up primarily after the 1930 explosion of ideas. We had none of that. We had an idea in this country that it was part of citizenship to subdue nature. That was actually part of the psyche of this country and of Canada. And that had to be not thrown away, but that had to be turned into a concern for keeping wildlife with us, that were often our competitors and were often dangerous. We had no tax policies like the Pittman-Robertson Act or anything like that existing at the time. We had no state agencies. We had no federal agencies. Nothing that we see today as being integral to the conservation of wildlife did we have. We had none of it. And these people, your people, the legacy people, they said, none of that matters. None of that matters. So what? We are going to move from the slaughter and excessive depletion to a point where we are going to sustain these populations, recover them, and rebuild them across this nation. And you know how we're going to do it? Not by stopping killing, which would have been a logical thing to do, seeing that's what was responsible for the decline. They said, no, we're going to make hunting the linchpin of that recovery. Now think how improbable that was. Let's say we're in the room in the 1880s, and we see wildlife being depleted because people are shooting them, killing them in excessive numbers. Don't you think it might be logical that we might say, well, what we should do is stop that? No, they stepped back and said, no, we're not going to stop that. We're actually going to make that, by law, under the law, accessible to every man and woman. We're going to make that the means by which we rescue them. They were geniuses. And not only that, they were courageous. Because nobody believed it was possible, and most people didn't want it, and a lot of people were against it. And a lot of those people were influential, wealthy, and had access to power. That's why even his own party said, what are we going to do about the cowboy in the White House? Now, what do we have as a result of the application of this model? We have a wildlife abundance on this continent that is absolutely extraordinary. We go from 50,000 wild turkeys to 5 million today, maybe 6 million. We go from a handful of elk in a few scattered places that need the protection of the cavalry to elk that are now being reestablished in the eastern states, etc. We go to a place where we can see so many white-tailed deer now in some places that people, of course, see them as vermin and as nuisances. When schools would be closed 100 years ago, if a track of one was seen, that's true. So that the children could see that a deer existed. We go to a time when Canada geese and snow geese are so superabundant, we don't know what to do with them. We have turkeys in our driveways, deer in our backyard. And we kept the big predators with us. As controversial as that is, one of the great achievements, we still had the wolf. We still had the grizzly bear. We still had the mountain lion. And do we want a world without them? No. No conservationist wants a world without them. We just want the right world. There's a big difference. We have the university programs. We have so many NGOs working for conservation, it's mind-numbing. We have state agencies. We have law enforcement. We have science. We have management. We have people working on non-game, small game, might be game, could be game, is game. You know, we have people working on habitat and on water quality, all those things which we didn't have. And we have it because of this model. And we have enough firepower in Canada and the United States to eliminate every single creeping, slithering, flying, walking, running creature on this continent. Except for what? Except that the people believe that this system of restricted personal access, of fair allocation under the law, and the fact that that resource is owned by everyone, they accept these principles, and therefore the system works. But we have challenges. We have challenges. The biggest challenge is we have 7 billion people. And every country is changing. Every nation is changing. And many of the changes that are taking place are irreversible. We may wish that we could stop them, but we can't. We can only work with them and manage them. I would like a Newfoundland that was the same as it was 30 years ago. I would give anything for that to be the case. But it cannot be the case, and it won't be the case. So at home, we have to hold on what matters most to us while accepting that change will occur. One of the extraordinary outcomes associated with the idea of wildlife in this country and in Canada has been that private landowners care. It is possible to imagine a society where private landowners did not care. But by and large, private landowners care, and care deeply. They care about the land they have, and they care about the wildlife that lives on that land. And I can cite you thousands of examples outside of the state of Texas where people have done extraordinary things for wildlife, and I can cite you just as many within this state where private landowners have done extraordinary things for wildlife. While 95% of your land or so is owned by private individuals, perhaps the even more overwhelming statistic is that the majority of land in the United States of America is in private hands, whether it's 1 acre or 100 acres or 500,000, but it's in private hands. And we must, as a society, find a way to acknowledge, to commend, to incentivize, to recognize, to promote the achievements that private landowners make for wildlife. Because that wildlife is wildlife that we all share in. And if collectively the private landowners of this state, the private landowners of this country and of Canada decided tomorrow to do the wrong things for wildlife, we would face an absolute disaster. Plus the fact, the days of large amounts of government money being able to be dispersed through many of the programs that we hold dear, in the short term are gone, and in the long term may not recover to the same extent as has been the case historically. Many people today outside of Texas talk about the issues of landowner use, privatization of wildlife, or the hunting of wildlife behind fences, or the manipulation of wildlife on private lands as a Texas phenomenon. This is a complete and utter untruth. While some of those processes began very early in this state in the 1920s and has a long history here, most of the land is owned by individuals, so whatever history was going to take place was going to take place on private land. We have tens of thousands of operations of various kinds in Canada and the United States across both countries that are applying similar experiments and similar approaches and so on and so forth. This issue of the North American model and its relationship to private land is not isolated to Texas. But you have an extraordinary opportunity to be the leaders in understanding how best to make these processes work together. I have had long discussions with a sister organization, Dallas Safari Club, about this issue over the years. I have led long discussions with other agencies in other states, that this is one of the leading, most important conservation missions for the next 25 to 30 years. We have to do two things in that period of time, or the successes we have enjoyed in the North American model are going to start to retreat. Because outside of our community of interest, there are many people who either don't care, who are opposed to many of the principles of the model, such as hunting, and believe me, they're not weaklings, they're well-funded, they're well-structured, they're well-organized, and the best thing to have in someone you disagree with is a division on that part of the table. Look at Congress. So we need to be very, very careful about two things. One is how to make sure that the private landowner's interests are sufficiently protected and how the private landowner's achievements are sufficiently recognized without endangering a model that for 120 years has given us success after success after success after success. And your country has changed a lot in 120 years. And so has Canada. Yet, the model continues to deliver. Not without problem, but it continues to deliver. The second thing we have to do is unite the conservation movement in a general sense and put together disparities and differences of opinion in an even wider arena. If we fail, from my perspective, it would be like failing democracy. If we fail, it will be like failing freedom under the law. If we fail, then I think we fail to recognize the legacy that we have, and we fail to pay due homage to the leaders that made this nation what it is. And despite challenges that every nation faces, and every nation in the world today is facing, deep down the world knows that the United States better remain strong, no matter what they say. That's what they believe. You have an extraordinary chance to really take this one of these major issues for the next 25 years in conservation and build something of lasting value, of deep significance, and profound penetration in the conservation movement. Maybe the model is not perfect, but nothing in human life is perfect. But the achievements that it has given to us are absolutely extraordinary. We must be careful that no matter how deeply we feel about our own issues, no matter how deeply we feel about our societies, that we must do the right thing for the long term, for the greatest number of people possible. It's to the benefits of the largest life of the nation, that must be the priorities. And I'm delighted to see you undertaking it, and it was an honor to be a part of it. Thank you.